And yeah, Margaret this time presented me brilliant book, Paradox. Margaret, written by Margaret Cuonzo, published at the MIT Press in the series Essential Knowledge. And from this time, I dream about our conversation on paradox. And this time is started now. And please, Margaret, we are happy to see you. And thank you very much that you change your time schedule. That I know you like get up early, but at the same time you adapted your time to our time. And I hope that we will maybe unite our time together and forever. Thank you so much. Let's start.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Golubiovich. I'm going to share my screen. It's such an honor to be here, and I'm going to share my screen if possible. Now maybe I'll hit play here. So yes, we've been neighbors. We've been friends, and so it's just really great to look across the screen and see you. And so thanks again for the invitation here. And I'd just like to add that I've really enjoyed attending this seminar. And I've listened to a number of your talks, and while listening to them, yeah, it made me think about another time and place when philosophers gathered together despite the fact of being surrounded by acts of military aggression. The year was 1941, and the place was Conway Hall in London. And there was a talk there by a philosopher and a psychoanalyst, J.C. Flugel. And he gave the talk to the South Place Ethical Society, and it was called The Moral Paradox of Peace and War. And if I can, I'd like to read the beginning of this talk to you. I have a hard copy here, and I thought, you know what, this is something kind of relevant to what's happening on this call here. So he begins. This is in all the 6th Conway Memorial Lecture out of a total series of 32 to be delivered during war. And since a year ago, war has come very appreciably nearer to our doors. So near, indeed, that we may count ourselves fortunate if Conway Hall still stands, and we ourselves still free to meet within it. For we know that at any moment, actual combat, with its noisy and destructive clamor, may break out all around us, threatening our lives, the lives of those who are near and dear to us, and the works and monuments of those who lived here before us and established the traditions that we are seeking to maintain. For more than 6 months now, we have been, as it has been aptly put, an ethical society under fire. At such times, it is difficult or impossible to divert our thoughts for long from the tremendous conflict going on around us, and I have made no attempt to do so in this lecture. I know of that 1941 lecture because I study paradoxes, and the title of Flugel's talk, The Moral Paradox of Peace and War, caught my eye when I was researching my book on paradoxes. Flugel's his talk presents a paradox that people in the audience and Flugel himself must have been grappling with at the time, namely that something that can be as evil as war can also induce great qualities in those who are engaged in it. Heroism, generosity, fellow feeling, compassion, and so on, can and were inspired by the horribleness of war. Indeed, Flugel thought that members of a state, war was crucial to uniting and creating cohesion among members of a state, and wonders somewhat tentatively whether other ways to satisfy human aggression, adventure, and to be engaged in meaningful endeavor would even be a good substitute channel for human aggression. He throws out at the end the substitution of war among nations with the war of humanity against quote unquote nature. He's understandably unaware the ways in which humanities, even at the time he's writing, was already in some ways at war with nature, and how nature might be considered a better ally than an enemy. At any rate, the moral paradox presented by Flugel strikes me as having a fairly easy solution. While surprising, it is possible for war to invoke evil actions and for it to inspire those engaged in it to great actions and maintain cohesion among the citizens of the state. These facts are not inherently contradictory. Many paradoxes of war admit of this kind of solution, as war engenders many contradictions on its surface. However, there are deeper paradoxes associated with war, and I'd like to focus more on those in the little bit of time we have with us today. I think it would be presumptuous of me to sort of draw the connections between these paradoxes um, in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I'll hint at some connections and differences, but don't pretend to be an expert and invite your input in these cases. So, before we begin, let me first provide a few definitions of paradox. On one definition, a paradox is a set of mutually inconsistent claims, each of which seem true. That comes from Nicholas Rescher. Another is that a paradox is an argument with seemingly true premises, seemingly correct reasoning, and an obviously false or contradictory conclusion. And finally, a third definition holds that a paradox is an unacceptable conclusion derived from seemingly good premises using seemingly good reasoning. So the second definition, Mackey's, and the third, Sainsbury's, focuses on the logical reasoning involved in the paradoxes. So take Flugel's paradox here. We've got a version of it formulated as a set of mutually at least surfacely mutually inconsistent conclusions, claims, each of which has some merit. And then we've got basically a proof that war is both good and evil. If following Sainsbury and Mackey, we think of Flugel's paradox as an argument with seemingly correct reasoning and seemingly true premises and a false or contradictory conclusion, then we have something like this argument here. A six premise argument with a contradictory conclusion. One word, and maybe I'll go back to the definitions here. One word shared by these definitions is the word seeming. Paradoxes confront our intuitions and what seems to be the case, sometimes forcing us to give up assumptions we previously held true, sometimes showing us that seemingly contradictory claims are not really contradictory at all, as in the Flugel example. And sometimes they force us to realize that the concept that engenders the paradox needs to be understood differently in order to avoid contradiction. And finally, sometimes even this is impossible. As for strategies for solving paradoxes, there are many. First, there is the questioning of an assumption made by the paradox. As we look at these formulations of the paradox here, for example, we might find some kind of flaw in the set of two claims or in the argument. For example, the first claim in the set of two claims might be thought objectionable. Likewise, the second premise in the formulation of the paradox as an argument might be held false. Sometimes it might be argued killing and destruction are unavoidable as a means of self-defense. Therefore, the argument is unsound. And the two claims, though possibly contradictory, are not both true. I call this type of solution, the strategy for solving paradoxes, the odd guy out approach, because it picks some kind of flaw in the paradoxical argument and then kind of pokes at it and tries to get rid of it. It strikes me that there's kind of a limited use to the odd guy out type of solution because paradoxes tend to be a little bit more resilient than this. The assumption that is false can be tweaked in such a way as to sidestep the objection. For example, in response to the objection that not all killing and destruction are evil, especially when they're in self-defense, the proponent for the paradox might tweak the premise and provide a strengthened version. If, for example, the current statement is revised to, quote, the killing of innocents and the destruction of property with no strategic significance at all is evil, close quote. This might invite further objections, producing further revisions indefinitely. Strong paradoxes, like the liar paradox in the case of truth, have invited and responded to so many odd guy out objections that there are many different versions of the paradox itself. There's strengthened version and so on. There are different ways of formulating it. Another strategy for paradoxes, what I call the it's good, so it's all good approach, holds that there is nothing inherently contradictory about the two claims. And that what looks like a contradictory conclusion, like 7 here in the slide, really isn't that contradictory when the senses of what's being said are made explicit. That is, for example, so in this case, that war is evil in some ways and good in others, and that can exist without contradiction. Many paradoxes of war invite this kind of all good solution. Princeton University sociologist Miguel Centeno teaches an online Coursera course called Paradoxes of War, which is free. And if you're interested, I have a link to it in my references. In it, he lists a number of what he calls paradoxes regarding war. They strike me as generally taking form of that first kind of formulation with the inconsistent claims, each of which seem true. And admit maybe of many of them admit of that kind of solution where you can have both at the same time. Centeno formulates these paradoxes along the lines of Rescher's definition. For example, he gives the example that war involves organization, but also creates chaos. Flugel too does this, in fact. He, in his Conway Hall lecture that I read you a little bit from, he uses Durbin and Bowlby's 1939 definition of war as, quote, organized fighting between two large groups of adult humans, close quote, and emphasizes that it bears the imprint of human will, forethought, and tenacity. Yet war creates chaos and destruction. War is organized on the one hand and creates chaos on the other. Other paradoxes are that are surface inconsistencies include the fact that war creates cohesion within a group, but it's always through tension or with another. By facing a common foe, the members of a society are brought closer together. Another is that war involves killing, which is both sanctioned and even honored in the context of battle, but otherwise unsanctioned and punished outside that context. After I gave a talk on paradoxes at a library in New York, a Vietnam veteran came up to me and said he was told before he went to Vietnam that he was going to be a hero fighting for the US in Vietnam. And then when he got back home, he was treated by many of his fellow citizens as, at best, someone who was fooled by the US government into participating in an unjust war, or at worst, a warmonger and cold blooded killer. Yet another inconsistency is that the individual soldier is supposed to be courageous and tenacious on the one hand, and yet submissive when it comes to following orders. Yet another, war is a creative endeavor, leading to new technologies. Yet the ultimate goal of the creation is the destruction of the enemy. War is devastatingly expensive, yet provides an economic engine that stimulates economies and sometimes creates a blank slate for innovation and development. War invites entire societies, yet the front lines are occupied by just a small fraction of the society. War is traditional and has traditional familiar symbols, such as flags, uniforms, formations. Yet the individual's experience of war is often otherworldly and strange. All these surface inconsistencies bring to mind the famous dictum that has been attributed to the scholastics. Whenever you meet a contradiction, make a distinction. Yes, war is in some sense X, but yes, war is in another sense not X. You can have both sides of the paradoxical pair at the same time, if you're specific enough. Yet, despite the fact that these contradictions can be made consistent by drawing distinctions, I think the fact that so many of these inconsistencies exist points to something deeper. Despite being capable of having the contradictions resolved by making the context clear before that being a possibility, there's so many of these that it indicates something about the rationality or irrationality of war, something I'll discuss at the end of the talk. But now for some deeper paradoxes that I think really do show an inconsistency among true claims and therefore engender other more limited types of solutions to paradoxes. These solutions often involve the revision of folk concepts, like those of deterrence or rational next step. They can only be solved via a revision of our understanding of the concepts that engender the paradox. For example, solving the liar paradox, the paradox about truth, would necessitate rethinking the very notion of truth. And sometimes the revision is unneeded or inherently unsuccessful. With respect to paradoxes of war, I think the deepest of these call into question our underlying conceptions of what a rational next step would be, the nature and value of deterrence, and what it means to deter or take a rational next step. To give an example, Zia Maotz, in his interesting book, Paradoxes of War, discusses the paradox of deterrence. He applies it to the beginning of war, but I think it can apply also to various escalations within a war and to other circumstances as well. According to this paradox, different deterrence measures, that is, those that are meant to discourage other states from military aggression toward the state engaged in the deterrence, often have the opposite result. And not because the deterrence measures were faulty in any way. Not only does the quote unquote successful deterrence fail to prevent military aggression, but it actually causes it. Part of the reason for this ties into what successful deterrence entails. Let's say there are two states, A and D, where A is considering initiating a military action against D. To successfully deter A, D must clearly communicate to A that D will respond to A's actions with some sort of retaliation that is very undesirable to A. D must also make it clear that D has the capacity to make good on these threats. And lastly, D must also convince A that D has the will to carry out the threats. D may successfully engage in all three prerequisites for deterrence, yet this may itself lead to A's rationally choosing to move forward nevertheless. One reason is that there are also less obvious demands on D that complicate the matter, and these conflict with the three main requirements mentioned of D. Specifically, if A is to be persuaded not to initiate military action, not only does A need to see that D's threats are in earnest, but also that D's threatened response would not otherwise happen. So if A engages in military action, A must also believe that if it chooses not to invade, then D won't engage in the threatened action on its own or without A's provocation. So in demonstrating its ability to retaliate and willingness to do so, D does something that calls into question another lesser requirement of the deterrence, namely that if A refrains from acting, that D won't just go ahead and retaliate without, quote unquote, retaliate without provocation. The more successful the conveyance of willingness, the less convincing it would be to claim that D wouldn't engage in the threatened retaliatory behavior out of its own initiative. By way of a somewhat kind of silly example here, I spend a lot of my time now in rural New Jersey, and in this area, many of my neighbors have guns. And this is one of the unfortunate, attributes of some U.S. citizenry, especially in the rural areas. Now, should my neighbor Chuck announce to the rest of us that he'll shoot anyone who trespasses on his land and demonstrates his many powerful guns and convinces us of his willingness to put a bullet through any trespasser, then we'd all believe him. Now, let's say my other neighbor, Brian, had wanted to trespass on Chuck's property to go hunting. Chuck has issued a threat that Brian thinks credible. Yet the willingness on Chuck's part to shoot him and the demonstration of all the force at Chuck's disposal might make Brian start to worry what Chuck is capable of, and indeed what his intentions are. That is, Brian might start to see Chuck as a danger to him. So, whether he trespasses or not. And this might make Brian more inclined to battle it out with Chuck than before. Point is that successfully demonstrating the capacity and willingness to do great harm, if an aggressor engages in action, does not logically preclude doing great harm if a potential aggressor decides not to engage in the action. And this itself may lead to conflict either in the near term or later. The standard truth conditions of the conditional statement if P then Q illustrate this. The truth of the conditional only implies that P will result in Q. it does not preclude Q happening on its own. So that would be like in the conditional statement, that would be like the third line there of F's and T's there. What this paradox illustrates is that simple threats without a clear indication of non-provocability, that is, the replacing of the conditional with the biconditional, would make a more rational case to a potential aggressor. So you see on the biconditional, if you'll see that the response happens if and only if the aggression takes place. Here's a simplified version of the decision tree for the paradox of I kind of took Moatz's decision, his account, and kind of tweaked it for this purpose here. So assuming A is rational, and I guess in context of war, it's not always that's not always a good assumption, but there you go. Assuming A is rational and has a choice here, A will analyze whether to initiate the aggression based on the probabilities of the various outcomes and how A values them in terms of utility. As mentioned above, if A chooses not to initiate, there remains a possibility, however small, and it might be zero, that D initiates. So without non-provocability, the higher probability of D's retaliation will tend to make the probability of D's acting unprovoked rise. If the probability of D retaliating were zero, let's say because D has no army, then the likelihood of initiating would be seemingly close to zero as well. As the probability of retaliation rises, though, with the show of force and willingness to harm made evident, then the probability of D's initiation is raised. In addition, you'll notice that one factor deciding whether to initiate, even assuming D won't initiate, is the utility of the status quo. If the utility of the status quo is low enough, so that's this line all the way at the bottom here, the, if the status quo is, low enough, then A may choose to initiate despite the retaliatory threats and believable retaliatory threats, and despite the likelihood of an unfavorable outcome. One strategy for solving the paradox of deterrence is to rethink the notion that leads to paradox, clarify it, make it more precise than commonly used. In my book, I call this a detour solution. Notice this doesn't solve the paradox, but creates a different, more useful way of looking at the relevant context. In this case, deterrence. First, the notion of non-provocability has to be taken into account. Threats do nothing in terms of deterrence if the deterred party believes those of using deterrence are likely to initiate. Second, the status quo must be taken into account. Truly successful deterrence may involve figuring out a way for the utility of the status quo to be high enough for A not to want to risk an initiation and the cost of its failure. Replacing threats and demonstrations of capacity and willingness to act with the subtler analysis, as given in sort of a tree like this, should be more useful. Here, you might think that simply adding a fourth requirement, so going back to here, just add the fourth requirement, the non-provocability requirement, constraint, is enough to avoid the paradox of deterrence, right? So it's just, however, a view of the decision tree shows that it's so little too fast. For example, should the status quo be so unacceptable to A, then even adding a non-provocability requirement for successful deterrence would not work. To deal with this paradox, a more nuanced approach that looks at all factors in the, involved in the decision needs to be employed. I mean, again, assuming rationality here. And I think a full understanding of the probabilities and utilities of the various outcomes would best approximate a solution to the paradox here. And so this goes not only for the beginnings of, but also for escalations within the context of war. So A may say, D may try to deter A's using of a particular weapon or whatnot. But the non-provocability is particularly at risk here because they're at war at this point anyway. So we can't necessarily, the two parties don't necessarily have much credence for believing that the other party won't be inclined to use the new type of weapon or the new type of combat. So the deterrence within the context of an already started crisis is often not very successful. Okay. So now for some strategic paradoxes. So paradoxes about steps within the context of war and rational next steps. The ones I'll discuss are treated in Mao Tzu's Paradoxes of War, among other places. They're discussed widely. These are the paradoxes of crisis escalation and sunk costs. So they can both be set up using something called the dollar cost auction, but the rules will change for each of them. In the case of the paradox of crisis escalation, the bidders in the auction can't cooperate with each other. They can't negotiate. They just have to make their bids, and that's it. In the case of the paradox of sunk costs, the bidders in the game can negotiate, can make a deal, can threaten, can cajole or whatnot. But ultimately, they have to go back and on a card submit their decision. Well, more on this later. Okay. So what the both paradoxes are going to try to do, and I'll go into the details of them in a second, is that once a crisis, that is a period of international conflict characterized by intense interactions among states, has occurred, turns out that both parties, despite making careful, rational moves, can lose control of the escalatory sequence, and even in the face of mounting losses for both sides. The paradoxes can be formulated, as I said, in various ways, but we'll introduce both of them with this dollar cost auction. So the way it's set up is players are each given a bankroll of $2.50 and offered a dollar in a kind of auction type sale. The US dollar, by the way, is 100 cents, just in case. So the dollar, 100 cents, goes to the highest bidder, no matter how high or how low the bidding is. In this game, though, the second highest bidder also pays the amount of his or her bid and gets nothing. The game allows, in this case, we're saying that it allows bids in increments of 5 cents. Okay. Okay. So if no cooperation is allowed, then the solution to this problem, according to O'Neill anyway, is given in a game tree of about 2,500 branches. And suffice it to say that normal human beings cannot make such decisions in the moment. And the most rational strategy is then not to enter the game at all. According to O'Neill, the optimal strategy is for the first player to make a bid that is a function of the player's bankroll and the stakes of the game, and for the second player not to bid. So if we're going to use this very elaborate, game tree, if the bankroll of the first player is $2.50, and the bids are set to a minimum of 5 cents per bid, the first player should bid 60 cents, excuse me, and the other player should stay out. But again, given the inability to use the huge game tree, the most rational strategy is not to enter the game at all. Also, if the second player knows the first player's strategy, the second player would rationally bid 65 cents. It seems, since this would result in a gain of 35 cents for the second player as opposed to breaking even. Okay. And if the game is entered, right, and by at least two players, then the unintended escalation starts and is a direct consequence of a reasonable process of reasoning. And so I'll have a scale. Okay, so let's take a look at the size. So let's say we're in the course of the bidding. So the dollar is offered. Each player has sort of a bankroll of $2.50. So somebody offers 5 cents because that's the lowest you could bid. And then then another person offers 10 and so on. So and the bidding continues. And so we get to the point where bidder one bids 95 cents for the dollar. So at this point, there's only going to be a 5 cent profit because the dollar is 100 cents. Bidder two has a choice of losing 90 cents or bidding a dollar for the dollar and breaking even. So the bidder two rationally bids $1. Now bidder one has a choice of losing 95 cents or bidding $1.05 and potentially losing 5 cents. So he's got, or bidder one has to weigh losing 95 cents against potentially only losing 5 cents. And given the two outcomes, rationally chooses to bid 105. And so on until, excuse me, one is bankrupt and the other winner pays far more excuse me, than the dollar is worth. Okay. So according to Maltz, in practice, the players typically enter the game and the pattern of play is one of infinite escalation. Starting with very small bids, play slows down around the dollar range and then goes past the dollar range and ends with the person who has the second largest bankroll exhausting his or her money. In actuality, the game has no winner. The second highest bidder has lost everything, and the winner, quote unquote, has paid far more for the dollar than it's worth. Both parties would have been better off if the game had ended sooner, yet each move in the game was justified. My own experience of the dollar cost auction is a little different. I tried it with my class a few, years ago, and sometimes a student would make an arbitrary decision after seeing where this is headed. At first, I thought this was that they didn't understand the different choices, like, oh, lose 95 cents versus, potentially only losing 5 cents and so on. But later I realized that they were more kind of quote unquote rational than I gave them credit for. They knew where this was headed and they just cut their losses despite not having very good reasons when considered as an individual next step. According to Costanza, the only true quote unquote rational thing to do at the end of the game is not to enter the game in the first place. Once the game is entered by at least two bidders, their fate is sealed and they behave if they behave rationally from that point on. Yet, according to O'Neill, if your opponent would not bid, you should clearly make some small bid. Thus, if the rational strategy for both is not to play and you know your opponent is rational, then you can deduce that the rational strategy for you is to play, which is a contradiction, of course, close quote. Once the dollar auction has been entered, each individual play in the game is rational. Yet when taken as a whole, the process leads to a worse outcome for both parties. And it is irrational to engage in such a process. So each of the individual steps in the game is in the player's interest, yet the total strategy is against it. The paradox can be applied to two nations going in war. In this case, usually the game has been entered. According to Maoz, quote, recklessness is the consequence of perfectly reasonable calculations involving the notion that escalation is perfectly controllable because war is something that nobody wants. Crises may escalate precisely because politicians are reasonable and prudent, and precisely because they do all in their power to avoid confrontation. In a system of interactions where what one gets depends as much on what the other actors do as on what one does, things may get out of hand precisely because each side tries to prevent them from getting out of hand, close quote. One way to treat a paradox like this one is to keep in mind that individual next steps are based on that are based on rational self-interest don't necessarily mean that a whole set of next steps will be rational. My streetwise students who acknowledged that it was quote unquote irrational not to move forward midway, but decided to stop playing nevertheless, knew where the whole process was going. I think that they were able to give up the short-term focus on immediate next steps for a better outcome in the end because they were motivated by keeping as much money as possible. Now, if the rules for the dollar cost auction are changed to allow for cooperation, then we have the makings of the sunk costs paradox. Assuming that both parties can be relied upon to fulfill their agreement, then the optimal strategy is for the first player to offer 5 cents and the second player not to bid. The two players would then divide the 95 cents profit. So we have that first upper left-hand box there. However, because there is no mechanism for ensuring either side will quote unquote play fair and meet their agreements, what results is a kind of an ongoing version of the infamous prisoner's dilemma. If you look at the slide, you'll see different options and outcomes of the various bidding strategies for the two bidders. If they both agree before the game begins to have one bidder bid 5 cents and the other withdraw, then assuming they both keep their word, the outcome is that each bidder splits the 95 cents windfall, the dollar minus the 5 cent bid, right? However, should one of the bidders not keep his or her word, then that bidder wins 95 cents while the other gets 0. And if they both discard their agreement and keep the game going, you get another iteration of the game. But this time, they must each put up more money for the dollar, right? And therefore, they've lost potentially the small amount there. So that's in the bottom right. It's a little tricky there, but the game continues because both of them have bid despite saying they were going to stop the game. So that means, of course, that they continue on the path of losing. And if they keep doing that, if they keep making an agreement and then defecting, one bidder will lose the entire bankroll, and the winner, quote unquote, will be in nearly as bad a position. As in the paradox of crisis escalation, in the paradox of sunk costs, even the quote unquote loser in this first round is in far better shape than letting the auction continue, yet each step along the way is rational, at least in terms of immediate next steps. These two paradoxes have often been taken to illustrate the difficulty nations face when deciding how to proceed or whether to proceed. The US war in Vietnam is often cited as a kind of illustrating the paradox of crisis escalation as a standard example of it. As far as solution types go, one potential solution is again to revisit the evaluation of rational next steps. In both paradoxes, individual steps in the escalation of the bidding are quote unquote rational when considered in individual terms. This is a little tentative, but one way to avoid the paradox here is to provide an alternative conception of rationality that is not focused solely on next steps, but rather on long-term goals. This, of course, needs fleshing out. We don't have time for that, but I'll leave it there. That seems to be the best strategy. If I have a little time here before I start wrapping up, I'll just throw out one last paradox here, and the last one is the paradox of allies, the ally paradox. It didn't seem to me quite as deep as some of the others, but I thought I'd mention it. The paradox aims to show that being a reliable ally can sometimes be as bad, if not worse, than being an unreliable one. If we define a reliable ally as one that can be depended upon to meet its agreements, to come to the support of its ally, the paradox attempts to show that this very reliability can harm both parties. So the standard example of this is Mussolini's Italy in World War II. With Germany, Italy is de facto neutral at first, and then despite an alliance with Germany, Mussolini had sort of visions of an Italian empire, wants Italy to take part in the war, discouraged multiple times by the Germans who knew how bad the army was and didn't think it was going to be a disaster. Nevertheless, the overzealous Italians start some campaigns in Greece and North Africa, and they were outnumbered by Greeks, fought back by and the small group of British troops fought them back in North Africa. And Germany, at this point, an ally of Italy, was now in a bind as not meeting agreements with the Italians might have repercussions for Germany's alliance with Japan. So Germany had to divert forces and then for non-essential parts of the war. Had Italy not been so zealous in its desire to engage in the war, it would have been far better for both Italy and Germany. The zealous willingness to act in support of its allies, that in that case was a liability. Anyway, I think this paradox is sort of invites that all good solution in which it's not contradictory to think that allies, like frankly, like friends or whatever, can be a detriment despite their zealousness or their reliability in terms of doing their part. Okay, so now I'd like to sort of take the discussion a little more generally, and to treat it a little bit more generally, and ask a couple of more general questions about paradoxes in war. The sheer number of paradoxes of various strengths that war engenders raises some deeper questions about the nature of war itself. Strikes me that contradictions, surface or otherwise, play a unique role in both logic and everyday life. Logicians are wont to say that anything can be derived from a contradiction. So, for example, if you have an inconsistent claim, like what's on the screen there, P and not P, you can derive anything you like, for example, R, by creating a disjunction with R and one side of the inconsistent conjunction. And then eliminating that side since there's a denial in one as well. So this is just a quick example here of like you have a contradictory statement. So P has got to be true there. And then you can create a disjunction or a statement by just as because P is true. You can add R, that P or R is going to be true. And then, of course, one says P and not P. So you could bring that down. And then you've got basically the disjunctive syllogism. You have a disjunction, an or statement. One side of it is denied. So R, which is just sort of came from the sky there, is proven. So notice R could be anything pulled from the sky. This basic logical reasoning, it's something I teach in basic intro to logic, yet the result of being able to prove anything means an explosion of quote unquote truths to the point where truth is in some sense meaningless. And this has curious results. Truth conceived of as something that can be tied to reality is lost. Why might this be relevant? Well, if truth claims are not tied to reality, then people lose their ability to think for themselves, and this makes them vulnerable to control by others. Coupled with authoritarian control, people without the ability to see what's true have little sense of whether those in power are being truthful and ultimately cannot use reason to give them a more reality-based worldview. So the inconsistencies have a function of blocking reason. Many of you, I imagine, are living with inconsistencies now, so perhaps in the question and answer period, we can discuss your views on them and whether despite the potential for separating out contexts and resolving them, there's something to be learned by the sheer number. Lastly, since war, like so many folk concepts that have been around from time immemorial, invites many paradoxes, an argument from analogy can be made here. Concepts like truth, mind, and knowledge engender multiple paradoxes. Each of these concepts is ancient and central to the way that we organize reality. In the case of mind, for example, contemporary philosophers have argued that such a folk concept, while useful in some contexts, has no place in a precise, completed cognitive science. Truth, too, has been, quote unquote, deflated, as it were, to the point of not looking very much like the ancient notion, folk concept. Can war be far behind, especially as it has been acknowledged as something so unwelcome? At the end of his online course on paradoxes of war, Centeno talks about the flaws in the Western way of war and how, when faced with insurgencies and guerrilla warfare, this way of warring often fails. Cyber warfare, other types of technological sabotage, and terrorism as well have changed the face of warring. Now is the time for a rethinking and hopefully a better, and maybe this is a naive, less destructive, less deadly way of thinking about war. At any rate, hopefully this discussion has shown the deeper paradoxes of war, and though not admitting easy solutions, force us to question and revise concepts like deterrence, rational steps, and so on. Let me end by going back to J.C. Flugel. J.C. Flugel's and that 1941 talk about the moral paradox of peace and war in Conway Hall during World War II. Despite the worries Flugel expressed at the beginning of his lecture, Conway Hall still stands in London and is open to visitors today. Freedom, intellectual or otherwise, is a powerful inspiration to us, and those who don't know it are often mistaken about its power. May freedom continue to ring for all of us. So, and that's it. So I'll stop my share here. Oh, if you're interested in that course, this is the link is here, Coursera. I'll leave that up for you. Okay, and then I'll just stop my share. How do I stop my share? Okay.
Yeah, Margaret, thank you so much for your amazing and very interesting presentation. I am applaud too, is Professor Lumer. And please, questions, comments, and discussion. Let's start. So many ideas, it's very difficult to collect to combine for the question. Christoph, please, your
Unmute now.
question.
Okay, thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. You put the question why there are so many, at least at the on the superficial view, so many paradoxes in war, but you didn't give an answer to that. Was that an open problem, or is there an answer in the end you would provide? So I would guess, for instance, it could be, of course, it's a bad thing, war, but people are, and because such a big, let's say, cost for both parties, they have to be brave, both for not losing too much and for winning. So therefore, we have at the one side the brave side of being engaged in war. On the other side, the main part, of course, is destruction. Would that be fine with you? Would that be your explanation, or do you have a quite different one? That would be interesting.
Yeah, so why so many? I think I was thinking that because the concept has to be so old and it's so part of human the way humans at least organize themselves politically and socially, that the concept itself is inherently contradictory, and that if we were to really look at it seriously and try to, in some sense, revise it, we would have to really change what it means to be a war. The same way I sort of tried to give a kind of analogy between things like the way, eliminative materialists, for example, think about thought or minds or things like that, these are useful concepts on kind of a basic level, but when you get more precise, that, yeah, you have to get rid of them, basically, because they do engender all these paradoxes. And truth, too, you think about Tarski and the way he tries to solve the liar paradox is sort of like, well, truth, the way we normally think about it, engenders these kinds of paradoxes of self-reference, like I'm lying right now or something like that. Is what I'm saying true? Is what I'm saying false? But but when we separate out, like when we give a more precise way of thinking about truth, and we lose, in some sense, its old meaning, but it becomes, let's say, useful in other ways. So I guess that's what I was wondering about anyway. Yeah.
Okay,
I mean, I
thank
guess.
you.
Thank you. Thank you. Any
Yeah.
questions, comments? Yaroslav, maybe, or not? No? You? Mhm.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Thank you very much for very interesting and inspiring talk. And so I am interested in logical aspects of the situation, especially you presented derivation that if we have a contradiction, then we can derive everything, anything what you want. Yes, and do you consider this by itself also a kind of paradox, a paradoxical situation, that when we can having some although paradoxical but definite information, we then derive, we then get this explosion and derive totally irrelevant conclusions. So it seems also to be a kind of logical paradox here, or intuitive paradox. How do you consider this? Thank you.
Right, right. So I think you were referring to that, the idea that, well, when you get these contradictions, you can prove anything, and then, right. And so you can prove the truth of this just random claim, but then the truth itself becomes meaningless because everything can be proven. And if everything can be proven, then truth is devalued to the point where maybe you can't even see a relationship to reality. I think that was your claim. So is that itself paradoxical? I would say yes, it is paradoxical. Yeah, yeah. When I was writing that, I was thinking about an old line from Hannah Arendt, where it was sort of the idea was like, it's in some sense lies are a little bit more there's more you could deal with a lie, because you find there's a tie to reality that could disprove it. But when you've got inconsistencies, and when you've got contradictions, there isn't that tie to reality, and there is this kind of like not knowing what to believe, and that is in some sense more dangerous than being having false beliefs, because it's it freezes. Our minds freeze. Our ideas are, we can't we don't know what to make of it, how to rationally respond to it.
But in this respect, should we consider any inconsistency or contradiction as a paradox, or not every inconsistency should be explicated as a paradox, but only
Yeah.
those that somehow cannot be resolved? So
Right.
if you can in some way resolve the inconsistency, then there is inconsistency, but there is no paradox. But if we
Right. Yeah,
cannot,
I think the way that the word seeming does a lot. Maybe I can share those definitions on if you don't mind, I'll bring up those definitions of paradox, and I think that might be useful. See if I can get to that up here. Yeah. So to get back, I don't know. I guess okay. Yeah. So it's that. So we take Rescher's definition there. You've got a set of inconsistent claims. If they don't all seem true, if one is obviously false, for example, then we don't have much of a paradox. I mean, I guess a lot rides on what seems to be the case in this case. So you can have inconsistent claims that are not paradoxical, or very paradoxical, very minimally paradoxical, because one of them is obviously false or something like that, or both of them, or so, so um, it's that seeming, it seems, is what makes the paradox in the case of like a Rescher, because it's not just that they're inconsistent, but each individual side um, seems to be true, and that's the problem, I think. Yeah, I'll stop that share unless anybody wants to stop the share. Do I stop that? Okay, I'm gonna try. Sorry. some reason I'm having a hard time. Oh, I think I can do it now. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Questions, comments? This is a very special for general philosophy, but especially in our Ukrainian space, humanitarian, very special language and skills, special mental skills. And I would like to ask you about your experience as a teacher of philosophy, yeah, with the students. What do you think about some maybe power of this style of thinking in the paradox? Are your students became well in this thinking in paradox or not? Is it easy or complex thing to adopt this kind of language and style of thinking?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is a little bit of a challenge because when I think about like some of my classes, I spend so much time trying to get my students to be consistent, and I try to see them like, okay, if your premises are true and you have good reasoning, then your conclusion, must be true. And then all of a sudden, 2 weeks later, here are some paradoxes where your premises do look true and the reasoning does look good, but oh, wait. So I sort of want to build up their faith in logic in some ways at the beginning of the course, like you can rely on reason to get you where you want to go in terms of your beliefs. But then, when we introduce the paradox, it's sort of like, oh, maybe reason, maybe there's a problem there too. So it's a delicate balance, I think, between, showing the logic and then showing potential problems with the logic, so that or with what seems to be like a failing, a seeming failure, even though maybe it's not. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah.
Questions, comments, discussion? Yeah, thank you, Norbert. Please.
Yeah, I have a question on the definitions of paradoxes just again. So maybe I overheard it, but what are your final thoughts on these definitions? Because they somehow behave quite different once you adopt the strategies to solve the paradoxes. So if one takes the definition of Rescher with this, it seems to be contradictory or whatever, I don't have it right before me, then it's still a paradox, even if you adopt the strategy of the it's all good solution. But if we take the definition of Mackey and the third one you offered, then once I contextualize, for instance, then it stops to be a paradox.
Right. So, in the case of the Rescher, we've just got sets of claims. And so, in that case, you don't really get a sense of the reasoning involved. So they're different in that regard. That's true. And in the case of the Mackey and also the Sainsbury, they focus on the reasoning, and so you can take issue with not just a claim necessarily, but you can take issue with, for example, the validity of an argument or something. I think it varies with certain contexts. Make certain different formulations of different paradoxes more more use. I think that for example, the Sorites paradox. That's a paradox that you really can't use Rescher's formulation of it. So the Sorites paradox, you have to use somebody like a Mackey or a Sainsbury's definition, because it's about conclusions you derive from something. So the way that this paradox goes is, take a person, with a full head of hair, and you pull out one hair, the person's non-bald, and you pull out another one, the person's still not bald. Eventually you'll pull out all the hairs, but and you'll have a bald person. But whatever number you specify differs from one more or one less by only one hair. So the way the paradox is typically formulated is an argument, which is premise 1, a person with 0 hairs is bald. Premise 2, for any number n, if a person with n hairs is bald, then a person with n plus 1 hairs is, right? You add 1 hair, the person's bald. Then the 1 hair is not going to make a difference. And then the conclusion is a person with, I don't know, 100,000 hairs is bald. So in that case, you can't really understand the paradox, I think, in that case, if it were simply a set of, it's just a lot easier to understand that paradox if you think of it as an argument, rather than as a set of claims. In other paradoxes, sometimes you're better off thinking of it as just a set of claims. Like, you could argue maybe the liar paradox. So I'm speaking, I'm speaking falsely right now, or I'm speaking, what I say right now is not true. Well, if it's true, that, then it's false. And if it's false, then it's, or if it's true, then it's not true. If it's not true, then it's true. So, so you've got that way of which certain paradoxes seem to lend themselves, I think, to that's my position, that certain paradoxes lend themselves to certain types of treatments. Although you could potentially translate something like the Sorites into a set of claims, but it becomes very awkward to do it. Yeah. So.
Okay, so in the end, you would take all the bunch of definitions and use them where they fit best.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So like the Sorites, you need an argument for that. If you're really gonna, I mean, it'll be really awkward to just, you could potentially, but it would be awkward. Whereas like, I think a lot of those those like paradoxes of war that Centeno mentions in his course is, it's in some sense unnecessary to put them in the form of an argument. You could say, well, war is chaotic, but it's also organized, and war is, creates technology, but it also destroys things. And so I think that those are paradoxes that kind of highlight the, they basically ascribe the two seemingly inconsistent things to one thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. It's very interesting talking, and very inspired by our repetition of the and new reading of this material. As usually, after some times, soon, our participants will have a chance to watch again, to follow for the arguments of Margaret, and for this very good presentation, and maybe to ask, to formulate new questions, I suppose.
Mhm. One thing, if I may, one thing I might want to ask the participants is if you saw any connections at all, like, I've been, studying these particular paradoxes long before this conflict, but long before the invasion. And so, a lot of my examples were from Vietnam or from World War II or something like that. So I don't know if you think about.
Yeah, dear Margaret, I will open your book in an introduction book published 2014. Yeah.
Mhm.
And after that, you presented me this book, and it's a introduction in a BBC television series. Call it Paradox. A British astrophysicist claimed to have images on a future explosion in which many people are going to die. And I will not continue to the next, but maybe unexpectedly you started from the example with the such paradox of future explosion, some catastrophic situation.
Yeah.
Really, I suppose you didn't maybe expect that this situation with the dangerous of explosion and dangerous of the collapse of the human civilization it will be so soon after 12 years after not 12.
Yeah.
Maybe this year it was started in Ukraine.
Right.
But my dreams that when you will write the new box of paradox, and it will be started from some peaceful and very and from the another kind of situation, yeah, maybe.
Right.
And my questions: what is the influence on the maybe understanding of the problem of paradox, such kind of catastrophic situation, because there are no any maybe choices, any that die or not to die, what is the good or what is the bad in this situation. What is your maybe such kind of existential, dangerous existential catastrophe? What on your point of view,
Yeah.
how it influence on the thinking about paradox?
Yeah, what you're saying reminds me a little of that, that idea like that it, that in one sense like, war is very traditional and familiar, but then the catastrophe happens and then it's otherworldly and like defies in some sense defies the reasoning and I think I'm just I guess I'm just sort of thinking that in those kinds of contexts that are so I don't want to say intense or catastrophic, uh I don't know. I don't know if reason really helps in those, if it's just defaults to human survival, or maybe I think you're more in a position than I to really.
I'll think about it. And my experience in New York was so contradictory when I visited Met museum. And
Mhm.
I visited some hall of weapon and war. It's a brilliant museum. Maybe it's the best in the world. And at the time of my visiting, I am cried because it's so beautiful thing, weapon. It's so beautiful tradition. And this time, I think maybe the war and conflict will be eternal thing for the human civilization, because aesthetic arguments here was what is it paradox this between aesthetical arguments about some weapon war, not only courage, not only some hero brevity and some aesthetical, beauty.
Yeah,
Is this paradox or maybe?
yeah. I
Mhm.
think so. I mean, war, like these images of war are so beautiful, like there's the beauty of the human, the virtues and the heroisms and the aesthetics of war and the paintings and all of this. And then there's what you experience, what I imagine people experience that's quite the opposite, right? The images, of destruction, of dismemberment, of whatever, and we've got these two sides to it. The beauty and then the horrible, ugly, the ugliness at the same time. Again, something so inconsistent in a way. Yeah.
Mhm.
When he
Thank
began, yeah,
No.
when he began his course in Tenos at a hall for the soldiers who died in World War II or something like this, and it was incredibly quiet. And it was like you could hear the voice echoing. And again, you've got this very quiet, almost church-like experience. And then when you think about what the actual experience of war is, quite the opposite with the sounds and the whatnot. So you could see they just sort of lend themselves, like all these inconsistencies seem to lend themselves to they kind of just pop up. And then of course that leads to the question, why so many of them? Why is there this and you can explain them away, right? You can say, oh well, they're just acknowledging, the heroism, but that can be true at the same time that war can be so chaotic and loud and and so on. But why so many?
Thank you so much. Thank you for all participants, for your questions, for your attention, for your visiting in the maybe uncomfortable time for your life, for your occupation, but you are here. I'm happy. Be safe, maybe have a hope on the best and good life without war. Thank you. We will have a program of the next seminar in next month, March, and I think Elena Mishalova for presentation of our new speaker. And next time, just now I will open our secrets, but after some days you receive a new invitation on the new seminar. Show must go on. Thank you.
Thank you.